To attain emancipation or salvation from the bondage of imagining ourselves to be a finite individual, we must know ourselves as we really are. That is, as the non-dual infinite and absolute consciousness of our own essential being. But where must we look in order to know ourselves thus? Can we know ourselves merely by looking in books or sacred texts? No, we obviously cannot. Because to know ourselves truly and accurately, we must look within ourselves in order to discern the true essence of our own being. That is, since we ourselves are the self that we wish to know, we can know ourselves only by investigating or examining our innermost being with a keenly focused and inwardly piercing attention. Our consciousness upon something is the basic and essential instrument by which we are able to know anything. Without attending to something, we cannot know it. Therefore, unless we actually attend to ourselves very keenly and carefully, we cannot truly and accurately know ourselves as we really are. True self-knowledge is not just some theoretical knowledge that we may understand by our intellect, but is only a clear and direct non-dual knowledge that we can acquire only through actual self-experience. By attending to the books that provide conceptual information about our real self, we can know only that conceptual information, but we cannot actually know ourselves. Whatever conceptual information or theoretical knowledge we may acquire about ourselves is extraneous to us, and hence it is something other than ourselves. Learning some theoretical information about the taste of chocolate is entirely different to actually experiencing the taste of chocolate. Likewise, learning some theoretical knowledge about our own real self is entirely different to actually experiencing ourself as we really are. We can never know ourself by looking outside ourself, but only by looking within. In fact, it is our habit of looking outside ourself and our intense liking to do so that actually prevents us from knowing ourselves as we really are. We do not need any other knowledge to know ourselves, because we always know I am. All we need do to know ourselves is to remove all extraneous knowledge that we have superimposed upon our basic knowledge of ourselves as I am. The extraneous knowledge that we have superimposed upon ourselves comes in many different forms. But what is common to all these manifold forms of knowledge is that we experience them all as I am knowing this. What is real in this experience is only the I am, and not the knowing this, which is merely a transient appearance. Therefore, in order to know the real I am as it is, all we have to do is to experience it without the superimposition of this ephemeral apparition or adjunct knowing this. Of all the ephemeral and imaginary adjuncts that we superimpose upon our basic knowledge I am, the most fundamental are our body and the other objects that we mistake to be ourself. Because we imagine certain objects such as our body to be ourself, we imagine other objects outside this body to be other than ourself, and hence we create the illusion of a distinction between ourself and other things, and the parallel illusion of inside and outside. In the philosophy of Vedanta, the objects that we imagine to be ourself are described as panchakosas, the 5 sheaths or 5 coverings, because in effect they enclose or cover our real self, obscuring in our view its true and infinite nature. These 5 sheaths that are classified in Vedanta are our physical body, our prana, or the life force within this body, our thinking mind, our discerning intellect, and the happiness that we experience in sleep as a seeming darkness or ignorance. Because the distinction between some of these sheaths is rather arbitrary, this classification is often simplified by saying that our real self is something seemingly enclosed within 3 bodies: our gross body, which means our physical body, our subtle body, which is our mind, and which is usually said to include both our prana and our intellect, and our causal body, which is the seeming darkness yet happiness that we experience in sleep. However, how we choose to classify these phenomena that we imagine to be ourself is unimportant, because none of them are the real self that we seek to know. Sri Ramana mentions this term panchakosas, or 5 sheaths, in this context only to emphasize the fact that we experience ourselves as if we existed inside these sheaths, or extraneous adjuncts, whereas we experience books as if they existed outside of them. Though books appear to exist outside ourselves, we can know them and understand them only through the medium of at least 3 of these sheaths, namely the senses of physical body, our mind, and our intellect. However, to know our real self, we must set aside or ignore all of these 5 sheaths, since they are not really ourself, and we must concentrate our entire attention upon our essential self-consciousness, our fundamental consciousness of our own being, I am. Therefore, since we cannot study any book without mistaking ourselves to be this body and mind, and since we cannot know our real self without giving up this mistaking identification, we can never know ourselves merely by studying books. Since the ultimate import of all sacred texts and other truly useful books is that we should know ourselves in order to experience true and perfect happiness, we must eventually forget all that we have learnt in books by turning our attention inwards with overwhelming love to know only our own real self or essential being. Everything that we learn from books or from any other source outside ourselves is an extraneous knowledge, which, having come to us at one time, must leave us at some other time. The only knowledge that is eternally with us is our basic knowledge I am, which is our consciousness of our own essential being. However, though it is ever present and known by us as our own self-conscious being, the true nature of this eternal knowledge now appears to be clouded and obscured by the transient superimposition of all our other knowledge. Since no knowledge that comes and goes can give us permanent happiness, the only knowledge we should seek is perfectly clear and accurate knowledge of our own being. That is, knowledge of ourself, free from the superimposition of any form of knowledge. The only true useful and beneficial knowledge that we can acquire from books or other external sources, including even the most sacred and holy books, is the knowledge that impresses upon us and convinces us of the need for us to turn our attention southwards in order to experience and directly know our own essential being. So long as our mind feels impelled by its desires to be active, studying a select few books that constantly, repeatedly, convincingly emphasize the truth that in order to experience eternal and infinite happiness, we must know our own real self, and musing frequently upon the truth revealed in such books will be a great aid in giving impetus to our love and efforts to practice self-attentiveness. This threefold process of repeatedly reading such books, musing upon their import, and trying to put what we learn from them into practice is known in Vedanta as Shravana, Manana, and Nidhyasana, and is recommended by Sri Ramana and other sages as the means by which we can gradually acquire the skill to remain steadfastly in the state of self-attentive being. However, though Sravana, or reading the right type of books, is recommended by Sri Ramana, this does not mean that we should read an endless number of books. Just a few really pertinent books are quite sufficient to support us in our efforts to practice self-attentiveness. Whereas studying deeply a few truly pertinent books can be a great aid to our practice of self-attentive being, reading a vast number of books can be a serious impediment. Therefore, in verse 34 of Uladu Narpadu, Anubandham, Sri Ramana says, for people of little intelligence, wife, children, and others, other relatives, form just one family. However, know that in the mind of people who have vast learning, there are not just one but many families in the form of books that stand as obstacles to yoga, spiritual practice. Though a strong attachment to our family can be an obstacle to our spiritual practice, because it can draw our mind outwards and make it difficult for us to remain free of thoughts in the state of self-attentive being, a strong attachment to all the knowledge that we have acquired from studying many books is a still greater obstacle, because it will fill our mind with many thoughts. If we are really intent upon experiencing the true goal of yoga, which is perfectly clear self-knowledge, we will not feel inclined to read vast quantities of sacred text or other philosophical books, because we will be eager to put into practice what we have learnt from a few really pertinent books, which explain that simple self-attentive being is the only means by which we can experience that goal. If instead we feel enthusiasm only to study an endless number of books, we will merely succeed in filling our mind with countless thoughts, which will draw our attention away from our essential consciousness of our own being. Thus, filling our mind with knowledge gathered from many books will be a great obstacle to our practice of self-attentive being. Excessive study will not only fill our mind with innumerable thoughts which will cloud our natural inner clarity of self-consciousness, but will also fill it with the pride of learning, which will prompt us to display our vast knowledge to other people and to expect them to appreciate and praise it. Therefore, in verse 36 of Uladu Narpadu Anubandham, Sri Ramana says, rather than people who, though learned, have not subsided, surrendered, or become subdued, humble, or still, the unlearned are saved. They are saved from the ghost of pride that possesses the learned. They are saved from the disease of many whirling thoughts. They are saved from running in search of fame, repute, respect, esteem, or glory. Know that what they are saved from is not just one evil. Of all the obstacles that can arise in our path when we are seeking true self-knowledge, the desire for praise, appreciation, respect, high regard, renown, or fame is one of the most delusive and therefore dangerous, and it is one to which the learned are particularly susceptible. Therefore, in verse 37 of Uladu Narpadu Anubandham, Sri Ramana says, though all the worlds are regarded by them as straw, and though all the sacred texts are within their hand, for people who come under the sway of the wicked whore who is Puhaski, praise, applause, appreciation, respect, high regard, renown, or fame, escaping their slavery to her is rare or very difficult. The first clause of this verse, though all the worlds are straw, implies that those of us who have studied vast amounts of philosophy may look down upon the normal, mundane pleasures of this world, heaven, and all other worlds as being a mere trifle, and may therefore imagine that we have renounced all desire for them. The second clause, though all the sacred texts are within hand, implies that we have mastered a vast range of scholastic knowledge about various systems of philosophy, religious belief, and other such subjects. However, in spite of all our vast learning and our seeming renunciation, if we fall prey to the desire for the extremely delusive pleasure of being an object of praise, appreciation, admiration, respect, high regard, acclaim, or fame, to free ourselves of such a desire is very difficult indeed. The desire for appreciation and respect is very subtle, and therefore powerful in its ability to delude us. And it is a desire to which even otherwise perfectly good people can easily fall a prey, particularly if they engage themselves in any activity that seems to benefit other people, such as teaching the principles of religion, philosophy, or moral conduct through either speech or writing. This desire is particularly dangerous for a spiritual aspirant, because the pleasure we feel in being appreciated and respected derives from our attachment to our ego or individual personality, our delusive sense that we are the person who is appreciated and respected. Therefore, if we are sincere in our desire to attain true self-knowledge, we should be extremely vigilant to avoid giving room in our mind to the rising of this desire. Until we attain the non-dual experience of true self-knowledge, we will not be able to remain completely unaffected either by any recognition, respect, appreciation, or praise that we may receive, or by any of their opposites, such as disregard, disrespect, depreciation, or criticism. Only when we attain true self-knowledge, and thereby discover that we are not this individual person who is being recognized, appreciated, or praised, or disregarded, disrespected, depreciated, or criticized, can we be truly unaffected by them. Therefore, in verse 38 of Uladu Narpadu Anubanham, Sri Ramana says, when we always abide unswervingly in our own true state of non-dual self-knowledge, without knowing the illusory distinction between myself and others, who is there besides ourself? What does it matter if whoever says whatever about us, since in that state we know that there is no one other than our own essential being? It would be as if we were extolling or disparaging ourselves only to ourselves. What indeed does it matter if to ourselves we extol or disparage ourselves, so long as we experience the existence of any person besides ourselves or the existence of anything other than our single, undivided, and non-dual consciousness of our own being I am? We should not imagine that we have attained true self-knowledge, or that we are impervious to all forms of appreciation and depreciation. Most importantly, we should never delude ourselves by imagining that we can be a true spiritual guru to other people, or pose as such, because the true spiritual guru is only the person who has ceased to exist as a separate individual person, having merged and dissolved in the absolute reality, thereby becoming one with it, and who therefore knows that the absolute reality, which is our own essential being, alone exists, and that there is truly no person other than it. So long as we feel ourselves to be a separate individual, we should always be wary of the delusion of pride, which can so easily rise within us. Even if, for example, we happen to write a book, like this one that I am now writing, exploring and discussing the teachings of a true spiritual guru such as Sri Ramana, we should never allow ourselves to fall prey to the subtle and powerful delusion of pride or egoism, imagining that we can claim credit for any clarity or wisdom that might appear in what we write. If we are able to express any clarity of understanding about the nature of the absolute reality, or about the means by which we can attain it, we should understand that that clarity is not our own, but belongs only to the source from which it arises, which is the one absolute reality that exists within each one of us as our own essential self-conscious being, and which manifests outwardly in the form of the true guru in order to indicate the truth that we are that reality, and that to know it, we must turn our attention back on ourselves in order to experience and thereby drown in our own essential being. If we have truly understood the teachings of any manifestation of the one true Guru, such as Sri Ramana, we will understand that as an individual person we are truly nothing, and that our mind or individual personality is a mere delusion, and is therefore not worthy of any praise or other form of appreciation. Self-delusive pride is the greatest danger that can arise as a result of excessive study of sacred texts and other philosophical books. The real purpose of studying such books, and the only true benefit we can derive from doing so, is twofold. Firstly, it is to understand clearly the means by which we can annihilate our ego, our sense of separate individuality, and thereby experience the one true and absolute knowledge, which is our non-dual consciousness of our own essential being. Secondly, and still more importantly, it is to cultivate an overwhelming love, to practice that means and thereby drown in the infinite happiness and peace of that true non-dual self-consciousness. Therefore, in verse 35 of Uladunarpadu Anubandham, Sri Ramana says, "What is the use of people who do not intend to erase the letter of fate, scrutinizing where they who know the letter of the words written in books were born, knowing that letter? O Sonagiri the wise, say, who else are they but people who have acquired the erudition or nature of a sound recording machine?" The letter is an idiomatic way of referring to destiny, the writing of fate, and also to the words written in books, the letter of the scriptures, as opposed to their spirit or true significance. The purpose or spirit of the words written in sacred text is to teach us how we can erase the letters of fate, only by annihilating our ego or mind, which imagines that it is doing actions or karmas and experiencing the destiny or fate that results from such actions. If we study the words written in sacred texts and other philosophical books, but still make no effort to put what we learned from those books into practice by turning our mind inwards to experience our own essential being, which is the source from which we as our ego were born or originated, and thereby annihilating this ego, who experiences the letters of fate, all our study and erudition are of no use. Thereby annihilating this ego who experiences the letters of fate, all our study and erudition are of no use whatsoever. Therefore, addressing God poetically as Sonagiri the wise, Sri Ramana concludes that if we gain vast erudition by studying books which teach that we can attain true and lasting happiness, only by annihilating our ego or mind, yet still have no intention to practice self-scrutiny, which is the only means by which we can annihilate it, we are merely gaining the erudition of a sound recording machine. That is the ability to regurgitate repeatedly whatever words or concepts we have recorded in our mind as a result of our study. What initially motivates us to read books on philosophy or religion is our desire to know the truth. But the true knowledge that we seek to acquire cannot be contained in any book or any words. True knowledge is only the absolute knowledge that lies beyond the reach of all thoughts and words. The words and concepts that are expressed in philosophical writings can only show us the means by which we can attain the true knowledge we seek, which always exists within us as our fundamental non-dual consciousness of our own essential being, I am. Therefore, in order to attain true knowledge, we must turn our attention away from books and concentrate it instead upon our own essential self-conscious being. True jnana vichara, investigation or examination of knowledge, is not the study of any philosophical concepts, but is only the keen and vigilant scrutiny of our own fundamental self-consciousness. Therefore, in verse 19 of Upadesa Undiyar, Sri Ramana says, when we scrutinize within ourselves, what is the place in which our mind rises as I? This false I will die. This alone is jnana vichara. The word which I have translated here as will die is the compound verb telai saindindum, which literally means become head bent. That is, bows its head in shame, modesty, or reverence, but which is commonly used in an idiomatic sense to mean dies. So long as our mind or ego, our false individual sense of I, which is our basic consciousness I am, mixed with various adjuncts or upadhis that we imagine to be ourself, appears to exist, we cannot experience the true adjunct-free nature of our real self-conscious I am. That is, our unqualified, undivided, non-dual, and absolute consciousness of our own essential being. Since this mind, our false I or ego, rises only by knowing things that appear to be other than itself, since it seems to exist only so long as we allow it to continue dwelling upon those other things, in order to annihilate it, we must turn it away from all its thoughts and concepts, that is, from all forms of knowledge that are extraneous to our fundamental self-consciousness, by concentrating it wholly and exclusively upon our own essential self-conscious being, which is the source from which it had arisen to know all those other forms of knowledge. No matter how many books we may read, we cannot attain true knowledge until and unless we forget all that we have learned from them, by thus concentrating our entire attention only upon our own true non-dual self-conscious being. If we have great enthusiasm to study a vast number of books and to remember all the concepts that we have learnt from them, we are likely to forget the true purpose of the books we study. Therefore, rather than reading many books, we would be wise to select a few books, which clearly and repeatedly emphasize the need for us to turn our minds inwards and drown it in the source from which it has risen, and that thereby enkindle and sustain our enthusiasm to practice the art of vigilantly self-attentive and therefore thought-free being. The most important books for us to study are those that contain the teachings of our own Guru. Though all sages have taught the same truth, they each have expressed it in different terms and with differing degrees of explicitness in order to suit the circumstances and the understanding of those they were addressing. Though our own real self has at various times manifested itself in the form of various sages, it has now manifested us in the form of our own particular Guru, in order to teach us the truth in a manner that is best suited to our own particular needs. It does not matter if we have never seen our Guru in physical form, as most of us have never seen Sri Ramana, because he is always manifest and available to us in the form of his teachings. Therefore, though we should have respect for the teachings of all sages, the teachings of our own Guru are sufficient for us, and will provide us with all the help and guidance that we need in order to be able to turn our mind inwards and practice steadfastly the art of self-attentive being. Whatever books we may read, we should always remember that the only true benefit that we can derive from reading is an added impetus or urge to turn our minds inwards and remain firmly self-attentive. If a book does not enkindle in our mind a clear understanding and strong conviction that the only means by which we can attain true happiness is to practice persistently the art of self-attentive being, or if it does not reinforce our existing understanding and conviction concerning this truth, there is truly no benefit in our reading such a book. In order for us to develop the skill that we require to hold fast to self-attentiveness, that is, in order for us to cultivate the necessary bhakti, or love, for our own being, and vairagya, or freedom from desire for anything other than our being, we must be single-mindedly interested and focused upon this one aim. Hence, we should avoid as far as possible anything that distracts us from it or that scatters our single-pointedness. Therefore, though there may be many books that emphasize more or less directly that we should restrain our mind from running outwards and should instead turn it inwards to attend to our mere being, we should nevertheless be wise to avoid reading more than a select few such books, because the same truth is expressed in many such books in many different ways, and with varying degrees of clarity and intensity, and hence by reading too many books, our mind will tend to become scattered and thereby to lose its concentrated and keenly focused impetus to cling tenaciously to simple self-attentiveness. Moreover, Though repeatedly reading a select few books may help to clarify our understanding and strengthen our conviction, we should always remember that the truth we seek is not actually contained in those books but only within ourselves. The truth or reality transcends all thoughts and words, so it can never be adequately expressed in any book, no matter how sacred we may hold that book to be. The words in sacred books can never express the truth as it really is, but can only point our mind towards that truth, which exists in the innermost depth of our being. Therefore, the benefit we can obtain from reading any book is very limited. As Sri Adi Shankara wrote in verse 364 of Viveka Chudamani, 100 times greater than the benefit of Shravana or reading is the benefit of Manana, musing or reflecting upon the truth that we have read, and 100,000 times greater than the benefit of Manana is the benefit of Nidhyayasana, or keen self-attentiveness, which is the correct application of the truth we have learnt by Shravana and understood by Manana. In the very first sentence of this 16th paragraph, Sri Ramana says that every sacred text or treatise teaches that to attain emancipation or salvation, we should restrain our mind, and that teaching mind restraint is therefore the ultimate aim or intention of all such texts. However, though all sacred texts agree on the fact that we should restrain our mind, different texts explain what is meant by mind restraint in different terms. Some sacred texts emphasize only the less subtle aspects of mind restraint, such as curbing the grosser forms of our desires. But though we may curb many or even most of our desires, we cannot restrain our mind completely and perfectly unless we manage to prevent it from rising at all to know even in the least thing other than ourselves. Therefore, since we can prevent or restrain the rising of our mind only by being vigilantly self-attentive, in the second sentence, Sri Ramana clarifies the true meaning of the term mind restraint or manu nigraha by saying, for restraining our mind it is necessary for us to investigate ourselves to know who we really are. What happens when we truly investigate ourselves is revealed by him in verse 25 of Uladu Narpadu and verse 17 of Upadesa Undiyar. Grasping form, a body, it our mind or ego comes into existence. Grasping form, that body, it persists. Grasping and feeding on form, thoughts or objects, it flourishes abundantly. Leaving form, one body or one thought, it grasps form, another body or another thought. However, if we examine it, this formless phantom ego takes flight. Know this truth or experience this disappearance of the ego by examining it. When we scrutinize the form of our mind without forgetfulness, we will discover that there is no such thing as mind, separate from or other than our real and essential self. For everyone, this is the direct path to true self-knowledge. That is, the more keenly we investigate, examine or scrutinize ourself, whom we now feel to be this finite individual consciousness that we call our ego or mind, the more this mind will subside and dissolve in our being. Because having no substantial existence or form of its own, it cannot stand in front of the clear and intense gaze of our self-attentiveness. When, by repeated practice, we gain the ability to maintain our self-scrutinizing attentiveness without forgetfulness, our mind will eventually sink into the innermost depth or core of our being, where we will experience the infinite clarity of true self-knowledge, which will dissolve our mind entirely by revealing the truth that no such thing has ever existed. That is, in the clear light of true self-knowledge, we will discover that we were never the mind that we imagined ourselves to be, but were always the real, infinite, and absolute consciousness of mere being. Just as in the clear light of day, we would discover that a rope that in the darkness of night we imagined to be a snake was never a snake, but was always only a rope. Like the snake, our mind is a mere figment of our imagination, and like the rope, our infinite consciousness of being is the sole reality underlying the illusory appearance of this mind. Just as if we were actually seeing only a rope, even when we imagined it to be a snake, so we are actually experiencing only our own infinite and absolute non-dual self-consciousness, even when we imagine it to be this duality-knowing consciousness that we call our mind. Therefore, since our mind is merely an illusion, an insubstantial, elusive, and ever-fleeting phantom created by our own imagination, we can effectively restrain it only by knowing the truth that we are really not it, as we now imagine ourselves to be, but are only the infinite fullness of being, consciousness, and happiness. Until we know this truth as our actual experience of ourself, we will continue to be deluded by this imaginary mind, and we will never really be able to restrain it entirely. Hence, since we can know ourselves as we really are, only by keenly and attentively scrutinizing our being, this practice of self-scrutiny, self-attentiveness, or self-investigation is the only means by which we can thoroughly and effectively restrain our mind. After saying that to attain mukti, or emancipation, we must restrain our mind, and that to restrain our mind we must investigate or examine ourselves in order to know who or what we really are, Sri Ramana goes on to define true emancipation later in the same paragraph by saying, knowing our yathartha svarupa, our own real self or being, having investigate who is our false individual self, who is in bondage, is mukti, emancipation, or liberation. What exactly does he mean by saying that we are in bondage? The bondage we are now in is not only our imaginary confinement within the limitations of this physical body, but is more fundamentally our imaginary confinement within the limitations of this finite consciousness we call our mind. We are, in reality, the infinite non-dual consciousness that knows nothing other than its own being, which is absolute peace and perfect happiness. Therefore, by imagining ourselves to be this finite mind, which rises by knowing duality or otherness, we are seemingly confining our perfectly happy and infinite being within the finite realm of dualistic knowledge, in which we experience a mixture of relative happiness and unhappiness. If we want to be eternally free from all unhappiness, we must free ourselves from the illusion that we are this finite mind. And to free ourselves from this illusion, we must know ourselves as we really are, that is, as infinite being, consciousness, and happiness. Since true self-knowledge is our real state of absolute non-duality, it is the state of infinite freedom, because when we experience it, we know that we alone exist, and that there is therefore nothing other than ourself to limit our freedom. The bondage that we now experience is an illusion, a figment of our imagination, because in reality our infinite being is never limited or bound in any way. Therefore, when we experience true self-knowledge, we will know the truth that we have always been perfectly free. Bondage is a state that is experienced only by our unreal mind and not by our real self. Therefore, since bondage exists only in the limited and distorted view of our mind and not in the unlimited and clear view of our real self, the concept of liberation or emancipation is true only in relation to our bondage ensnared mind. Hence in verse 39 of Uladunarpadu, Sri Ramana says, only so long as we imagine I am a person in bondage will thoughts of bondage and liberation arise. When we see our real self by investigating who is this person in bondage, our real self, which is eternally liberated, will remain alone, experiencing itself as that which is always attained. When our real self remains experiencing itself thus, since the thought of bondage cannot remain, can the thought of liberation alone remain in front of such clear self-knowledge? Liberation, or true self-knowledge, is not actually a state that we can newly attain, because, in truth, we are always the non-dual consciousness of being, that never ceases to know itself and which is therefore eternally liberated. However, since we now imagine ourselves to be this bondage-ensnared mind, from the standpoint of this imaginary experience, it is necessary for us to free ourselves from this illusion of self-ignorance and bondage. Therefore, so long as we experience ourselves to be this mind, our notions of bondage and liberation are in effect quite true and perfectly valid. That is, so long as we experience ourselves as being bound by limitations, our desire to attain true self-knowledge and thereby to be liberated from such bondage is both valid and necessary. However, though it is necessary for us now to make every possible effort to attain true self-knowledge by investigating the reality of our mind, which is in bondage, when we actually experience the self-knowledge that we now seek, we will discover that we are not this bondage-ensnared mind, but only our eternally liberated real self. When we thus discover that our bondage is entirely unreal, being a mere figment of our imagination, our liberation or emancipation from that bondage will also be unreal. That is, we will discover that we are eternally and infinitely free, and hence we will not feel we have ever been freed or liberated from anything. After defining mukti or liberation and indicating that we can attain it only by investigating or scrutinizing ourselves, Sri Ramana goes on to define atma-vichara or self-investigation, and while doing so he contrasts it with the practice of dhyana or meditation, saying, the name atma-vichara is truly applicable only to the practice of always being or remaining, having put, placed, kept, seated, deposited, detained, fixed, or established our mind in Atma, our own real self, whereas dhyana meditation is imagining ourselves to be Satchit Ananda Brahman, the absolute reality which is being consciousness bliss. Since self-investigation or atma-vichara is the practice of remaining with our mind fixed in our real self, which is infinite and absolute being, it is a practice of just being without any mental activity. In contrast, the term meditation or dhyana is commonly understood to denote the practice of thinking or imagining ourselves to be God or Brahman, the infinite and absolute reality, whose nature is Satchitananda or being consciousness bliss, and as such meditation is merely a mental activity. This radical distinction between the practice of true self-investigation or atma-vichara and the practice of meditating, I am Brahman, was often emphasized by Sri Ramana, as for example in verse 29 of Uladu Narpadu, in which he says, without saying I by mouth, scrutinizing by our inward sinking, diving or piercing mind, where does it, this mind, rise as I? Alone is the path of jnana, the practice that leads to true knowledge. Instead of practicing such deep thought-free self-scrutiny, thinking, I am not this body or mind, I am that Brahman or that absolute reality, is merely an aid. But can it be vichara, self-investigation or self-scrutiny? True vichara or self-investigation is only the practice of our sinking or penetrating inwards with our entire mind or attention focused on our source or true being, our fundamental consciousness I am. Meditating or dwelling upon the thought that we are not this body or mind, but are only the infinite and absolute reality may be an aid in helping us to convince ourselves of our need to turn inwards, to know ourselves. But it cannot itself be the actual process of self-investigation, because it is an extroverted activity of our mind. When sages and sacred books tell us that we are not this finite body or mind, but are only the infinite and absolute reality, their aim is to prompt us to turn our attention inwards to scrutinize ourselves in order to discover what we really are. Instead of turning and sinking inwards thus, if we merely think I am not this, I am that, we have clearly misunderstood the purpose of their teaching. Therefore, in verse 32 of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana says, when the Vedas or other sacred texts proclaim that absolute reality is you, and are thinking, I am that absolute reality, and not this body or mind, and not just being that absolute reality by examining ourselves to ascertain what am I, is due to lack of mental strength or discrimination, because that absolute reality always abides as ourself. When we are told that is you, we should investigate and know what am I. If instead we simply meditate, I am that, Sri Ramana says that this is due to absence or lack of uran or mental strength. The word uran literally means strength of will, self-control or knowledge. But in this context, it means specifically strength of conviction. If we are truly convinced that we are that, we will not feel any need or desire to meditate, I am that, but will instead feel only a strong urge and love to scrutinize ourselves in order to discover, I am what. Since that absolute and infinite reality always exists as our own real self or essential being, we cannot know it until we know ourselves. Therefore, if we truly have love for the infinite fullness of that being that we call God, we should meditate only upon ourselves, and not upon any thought of God or even upon the thought I am God. Any thought that we form in our mind is an imagination, and is experienced by us as something other than ourselves. So no thought can be God. Whatever may be our conception of God, that conception is not God, and does not come even close to defining Him, because He is the infinite reality, which transcends all thoughts and mental conceptions. The thought of God is useful to us only so long as we imagine ourselves to be this finite individual who feels, I am this body. But if we get rid of this imagination by knowing ourselves as we really are, no thought of God will be necessary, because we will experience Him directly as our own real self. Until we experience Him thus, thinking of Him as beneficial, but rather than thinking of Him as other than ourself, thinking of Him as our real self is more beneficial. Therefore, in verse 8 of Upadesa Undiyar, Sri Ramana says, rather than Anya Bhava, considering God to be Anya or other than ourself, Ananya Bhava, considering Himself to be Ananya or not other than ourself, He is I, indeed best among all ways of thinking of God. However, since God is our own real self, rather than meditating He is I or thinking of Him as other than ourself, putting aside all thoughts of God and meditating only upon our own self, or essential being, is the most perfect way of meditating upon Him. If we are truly convinced that He is I, why should we continue thinking repeatedly He is I, instead of just being keenly self-attentive in order to experience ourselves as the pure and infinite being that we really are? Therefore, in verse 36 of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana says, If we think that we are this body, that meditation which is thinking instead that no, we are not this body, we are that, is a good aid to convince and remind us of the need for abiding in the state of true non-dual self-consciousness in which we experience ourselves as we are, that absolute reality. However, since we in truth always abide as that, why should we be always thinking that we are that? In order to know that we are human, do we need to think, I am a man? Thinking that we are God or the absolute reality is beneficial only insofar as it can help us to convince and remind ourselves that we should not rise as this thinking mind, but should instead abide as our own real self, which is that absolute reality, whose nature is just being and not doing or thinking anything. But just as we do not feel any need to think I am a human being, because we always experience ourselves as such, so there is no need for us to think repeatedly, I am that, because we always are that, whether or not we think so. Therefore, since we are in truth always only that absolute reality, our aim should be to experience ourselves as such, and in order to experience ourselves thus, we must subside in our being, remaining without rising to think anything. Therefore, in verse 27 of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana says, the state of just being in which I, this mind, does not rise as a seemingly separate entity, is the state in which we are that, without scrutinizing the place, abode, or source where I rises. How is it possible for us to reach the loss of our individual self, which is the egoless state in which I does not rise? Without reaching this state of egolessness or annihilation of our individuality, say, how can we remain abiding in the state of our own real self, in which we experience ourself as myself is that? We can experience ourselves as God, the infinite and absolute reality, only in our natural state of complete egolessness, in which we do not rise as a separate individual I or mind. In order to remain without rising as this mind, we must keenly scrutinize our innermost being, which is the source from which we have risen. When we keenly, vigilantly, and unwaveringly scrutinize our innermost being, we will sink and merge into it, becoming one with it, and in the resulting state of egoless non-dual self-consciousness, we will experience the truth that we are the absolute reality that we now call God or Brahman. This practice of keen, vigilant, and unwavering self-scrutiny or self-attentiveness is the practice of being, having placed our mind in our real self, which Sri Ramana described when he said, the name Atma Vichara is truly applicable only to the practice of always being, abiding or remaining, having placed or fixed our mind in Atma, our own real self, and it is the only means by which we can effectively restrain or prevent the rising of our mind. In contrast to this simple practice of self-attentive being, which is entirely devoid of mental activity, the practice of meditating, I am the absolute reality, is a mental activity, and hence it actually sustains the rising of our mind and prevents its subsidence. In practice, the meditation of dhyana that Sri Ramana described when he said, whereas dhyana is imagining ourselves to be Satchit Ananda Brahman, the absolute reality which is being consciousness bliss, is just a process of remembering some information that we have learnt from sacred books or sages, namely that we are in truth the absolute reality, which is infinite being, consciousness, and happiness, and trying to imagine ourselves as such. So long as we practice such bhavana or imaginative meditation, we clearly do not know our real self, because if we did, we would not feel any need for such practice. Therefore, since we do not know our real self, we clearly do not know Brahman or the absolute reality, nor do we know the true experience of being infinite being consciousness bliss. For our self-ignorant mind terms such as God Brahman, the absolute reality, and Satchit Ananda or being consciousness bliss, all denote only mental concepts and not any actual experience. Sri Ramana concludes this 16th paragraph by saying, "At one time it will become necessary for us to forget all that we have learnt, because all the information that we have learnt, including all that we have learnt from sacred books about God or the absolute reality, is only a collection of thoughts or mental conceptions, whereas the reality transcends not only all thoughts and concepts, but even the mind which thinks and knows such thoughts and concepts. Therefore, to know ourselves as the absolute reality or Brahman, we must forget all such thoughts, and even our mind that thinks them, and must instead remain self-attentively as our own mere being, which is devoid of all thoughts and mental activity." When Sri Ramana defines dhyana or meditation as the practice of imagining ourselves to be Satchit Ananda Brahman, we should not confuse this word of dhyana in this context with his earlier use of the term svarupa, dhyana, or self-meditation in the 10th paragraph. The Sanskrit word dhyana derives from the verbal root dhya or dhyai, which means to think of, imagine, meditate upon, ponder over, reflect upon, consider, or recollect, and hence it literally means meditation, thought or reflection. As such, dhyana is definitely a mental activity, a process of imagining or thinking of something. However, when the word dhyana is applied to ourself as svarupa dhyana, it does not literally mean meditation or thinking, because our real self or being is not an object that we think of. If we try to think of or meditate upon ourself, our thinking mind will begin to subside, because it can rise and be active only by thinking of or attending to things other than itself. Therefore, the practice of svarupa dhyana or self-meditation is unlike all other forms of meditation, because it is not a mental activity or any form of doing or thinking, but is just the state of self-attentive being. The true meaning of meditating upon being, the reality or that which is beautifully explained by Sri Ramana in the first of the 2 verses of the Mangalam or auspicious introduction to Uladu Narpadu, which he initially composed as a 2-line verse in Kural Venba meter, in which he said, "How to or who can meditate upon our being essence? Being in our heart as we truly are alone is meditating upon our being. Know this." However, in order to match the meter of all the other verses in Uladu Narpadu, and to explain in more detail the subtle truth that he expressed so succinctly in this Kural verse, he later added to it 2 opening lines, thereby transforming it into its present form, which is a 4-line verse in Venba meter, in which he says, "Other than Uladu, that which is or being, is there consciousness of being? Since this being essence, this existing substance or reality which is in our heart, devoid of all thought, how to or who can think of or meditate upon this being essence, which is called heart, being in our heart as we truly are, that is, as our thought-free, non-dual consciousness of being I am, alone is meditating upon our being. Know this truth by experiencing it." The Tamil original verse of this is a beautiful composition rich in alliteration and profound in meaning. Of its 15 metrical feet, the first 14 begin with the syllable ul, which is a root word that has 2 distinct but closely related meanings. That is, ul is the base of a tenseless verb meaning to be or to have, and is also a separate but related word meaning within, inside, or interior. Of the 14 words in this verse that begin with this syllable, ul, 8 are various words derived from the former sense of ul as the base of a tenseless verb meaning in this context to be, while the other 6 are words derived from the latter sense of ul as a word meaning within, inside, or interior. Of these 6 words, 3 are forms of the word ulam, which means heart, core, mind, consciousness, or self, and the other 3 are the word ulal, which means thought, thinking, or meditating, being a literary form of the verbal stem ulutal, which means thinking. The first sentence of this verse is a simple question, but one with a very deep and broad meaning. Uladu, aladu, ula, unarvu, ulado, as a noun uladu, which is a term used in Tamil philosophical literature to denote the reality, truth, or spirit, is both a compound noun, meaning that, adu, which is ula, and a gerund, meaning being. However, these 2 meanings are essentially identical because that which is not other than or in any way distinct from its own natural state of being, and hence they are both appropriate in this context. The word aladu can be an adversative conjunction meaning or, if not, or else, or it can mean except as, other than, or besides. The compound word ula unarvu means consciousness which is, being consciousness, or consciousness of being, and ulado is an interrogative form of the third-person singular verb uladu, and therefore means is there, or does it exist? Thus, this first sentence gives various shades of meaning such as if being were not, could there be consciousness of being? Except as other than or besides that which is there any consciousness of being? Or can our consciousness of being, I am, be other than our own being? Though all these shades of meaning are closely related, parallel, and compatible with each other, they are each an alternative and helpful way of understanding the same basic truth. Among the various shades of meaning implied in this first sentence, an important one derives from the fact that uladu means that which is, and therefore in its literal sense it denotes only that which really is and not anything which merely seems to be. That is, it does not denote merely a relative, finite, partial, or qualified form of being, but only the absolute, infinite, indivisible, and unqualified form of being, the being which really is. Hence, an important meaning implied in this sentence is that if we were not an absolute being, could we be conscious of being? That is, we are conscious of being only because there is something that really is, something that is absolutely, unconditionally, infinitely, eternally, and immutably real. Thus, this sentence is a powerful argument that establishes the truth that our mere consciousness of being clearly indicates the existence of an absolute reality, an unqualified form of being, an essential isness or emness which underlies all forms of knowledge. This essential and absolute being is our own being, I am, because I am is the fundamental being which we always experience and which is the base for our knowledge of all other forms of being. Since our essential being, or emness, underlies and supports all our knowledge, including our knowledge of time, space, and all other such limiting dimensions, it itself must transcend all limitations and must therefore be eternally, immutably, infinitely, and absolutely real. Though the word uladu, or that which is, may superficially appear to denote some being that exists as that, an object other than ourself, this is not the sense in which Sri Ramana intends us to understand it. that which really exists, and which we always know as existing, is only our own being, which we experience as I am. Our knowledge or consciousness of the being or existence of any other thing appears and disappears, and is therefore just an ephemeral apparition. Moreover, the consciousness that knows the being or existence of other things is only our mind, and those other things that it knows are all merely thoughts or mental images that it forms within itself by its own power of imagination. Since both our mind and all the other things that it knows appear and disappear, their seeming reality is finite, relative, and conditional, and hence they cannot be the absolute reality that is denoted by the word uladu, or that which really is. Therefore, in the context in which Sri Ramana uses it, the word uladu does not denote any seeming reality that our mind knows as other than itself, but denotes only the absolute reality that underlies and supports the appearance of our mind. That is, it denotes only our own being, the first-person being I am, and not any other form of being, any second or third-person being such as it is. This fact is made even more clear by Sri Ramana in the second sentence of this verse, in which he says that the ula porul, the substance that is, or reality that is, exists in our heart and is devoid of thought, and that it is in fact that which we call our heart, or the core of our being. Therefore the words uladu and ula porul denote only the thought-free reality that exists within us as our own essential being. Whereas most sacred texts and other philosophical writings that attempt to establish the existence of God or the absolute reality do so by arguing that there must be an absolute cause, source, or basis for the appearance of this world. In this first sentence of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana establishes the existence of the absolute reality by simply pointing out that we could not be conscious of our own being or existence if we were not that which really is. That is, if we did not really exist, we could not know I am. Therefore, our own essential self-conscious being, which we always experience as I am, is absolutely real. Since all other things depend for their seeming existence or being upon our knowledge of them, they are all merely relatively real, and not absolutely real. The only thing that we know as the absolute reality is our own essential being or emness, whereas the being or isness of all other things, including both this entire world and any God whom we conceive as being separate from our own being, are only relative forms of reality. Therefore, in this simple sentence, if that which were not, would there be consciousness of being? Sri Ramana indicates that the only evidence we require to prove the existence of the absolute reality, that which really is our simple consciousness of our own being. Thus, he implies that since our knowledge of all other things depends upon our knowledge of our own being, I am, any argument that we may give to establish the existence of the absolute reality based merely upon the seeming existence of otherness instead of upon our fundamental knowledge of our own being is inherently flawed. This is why all the usual arguments about the existence or non-existence of God can never be resolved unless we first consider the reality of our own existence. We can never establish the existence of the absolute reality or God on the basis of the seeming existence of this world, but only upon the indubitable existence of ourself. Because we know the world, we know that we certainly exist to know it. The existence of the world may be a mere apparition or imagination, like the seeming existence of the world that we know in a dream. But our own existence is undoubtedly real, because if we did not really exist, we could not know either our own existence or the seeming existence of any other thing. Therefore, Sri Ramana begins the main text of Uladu Narpadu by saying in verse 1, because we see or perceive the world, accepting the existence of one mudal, first principle, origin, source, base, fundamental reality or primal substance, which has a power which is manifold or diverse, that is, a power to appear as if it were many diverse things, is indeed unavoidable. The picture of names informs this entire world appearance. The seer, our mind which perceives it, the underlying or existing screen on which it appears, and the shining light of consciousness by which we perceive it, all these are He, this one primal substance, who is our own real self. The one mudal, the sole fundamental reality, basic essence or primal substance, which Sri Ramana refers to in this verse, and which he says is our own real self, is the same absolute reality that he describes as Uladu, or that which is, in the first Mangalam verse. Because we know I am, we know that this one original, fundamental, absolute reality, which is our own real self or essential being, does indeed exist. And because when we rise as our mind, we seemingly experience within it many other things besides our own being, we know that our single self-conscious being has the power to appear as if it were many diverse things. All these diverse things, namely this entire world appearance, which rises in our mind as series of mental images, and which is like a motion picture projected upon a screen, our mind, which experiences this picture, the underlying screen or substratum of being from which, in which, and upon which both our mind and this whole picture of ever-changing mental images appear, and the clear light of consciousness that enables us to experience this entire dream show, are in essence only the one primal substance or fundamental non-dual reality, which is our own real self or essential being. That is because all this multiplicity arises in us like a dream and disappears when our mind subsides in sleep. The substance from which it is formed is only our own non-dual self-conscious being, which is the one fundamental and absolute reality. Though in this verse Sri Ramana seems to affirm the existence of this non-dual absolute reality on the basis of our experience of this world appearance, he actually begins this verse with the word nam, which means we, thereby placing emphasis not upon the world as such, but only upon ourself, who seem to perceive this world. This emphasis is reiterated by him still more strongly in the final words of this verse, tan avan, which means he who is self, and which therefore clearly indicate what he actually means by the term one mudal, namely that he, the one mudal or God, who is the one fundamental reality or primal substance that underlies and appears as all this multiplicity, is only our own real self, or essential being. Thus, in this verse, Sri Ramana actually establishes the existence of the absolute reality based not upon the seeming existence of the world, but only upon the indubitable existence of ourself, who seem to cognize it. However, whereas in this first verse of the main text of Uladu Narpadu, he establishes the existence of the absolute reality in an indirect manner based upon our transient consciousness of this world. In the first sentence of the first verse of the Mangalam, or auspicious introduction to Uladu Narpadu, he establishes it in a direct manner, based upon our permanent consciousness of our own simple being. That is, whether or not we perceive this world, we always experience the absolute reality, that which is, because we are always conscious of our own essential being I am. Since we always clearly know our own being or emness, it is indeed that which really is, and hence we need no other evidence to convince ourselves of the indubitable existence of that which is. We, who are in essence the self-conscious being that we always experience as I am, are ourself that which truly is, that which definitely is, that which exists unconditionally and independently, and which is therefore absolutely real. Another shade of meaning conveyed in this first sentence is based upon the meaning implied by the compound word ula unarvu. That is, since ula unarvu means being consciousness or consciousness of being, and since the first and fundamental form in which we are conscious of being is the consciousness or knowledge that we have of our own being, which we experience as M, the meaning implied by ula unarvu is this basic consciousness M, which is our first-person consciousness of our own being. Since M is a predicate, it must have a subject, and that subject can only be I, which is the real being denoted here by the word uladu. Therefore, one meaning implied in this first sentence is, if the fundamental being I did not really exist, could we experience this consciousness M? Moreover, since aladu means not only unless or if not, but also other than or besides, another parallel but slightly different shade of meaning conveyed in this sentence is, can our consciousness M be other than our essential being I? That is, our consciousness of our being, which is denoted by the word M, is not other than our being, which is denoted by the word I. When we interpret aladu as meaning other than, this same basic meaning stands even without our involving the inferred words I and M. That is, one meaning that is clearly conveyed in this first sentence is, other than that which is there any consciousness which is to know that which is, or more simply, other than being, is there any consciousness of being? In other words, consciousness is itself being, because if it were other than being, consciousness would not be, and therefore could not know being. This is the same crucially important truth that Sri Ramana expresses in very similar words in verse 23 of Upadesa Undiyar. Because of the non-existence of any unarvu, consciousness other than uladu, to know uladu, that which is or being, uladu is unarvu. That unarvu itself exists as we, our essential being or true self. The crucial truth which is stated explicitly in this verse of Upadesa Undiyar, and which is also implied clearly in this first sentence of Uladu Narpadu, is in perfect accord with the experience of each one of us, because the basic form in which we each experience our consciousness is as our consciousness of ourself or our own being. Our consciousness is conscious of its own being because, since it is consciousness, its being is essentially self-conscious. Or to express the same truth more directly, we are conscious of our own being because, since we ourselves are consciousness, our being is essentially self-conscious, and hence our consciousness and our being are inseparable. That is, we are not only being or uladu, that which is, but are also consciousness of being or ula unarvu, that which is conscious of that which is. Yet another shade of meaning, one that is important in the context of the rest of this verse, derives from the fact that besides meaning which is or of being, the word ula in ula unarvu can also mean to think, because it can be interpreted as being the infinitive form of the verb ulutal. Viewed in this sense, the meaning of this first sentence would be, other than that which is there a consciousness to think of it? That is, since we are not separate from the absolute reality upon which we wish to meditate, we can only meditate upon it truly by experiencing it as ourself. And since it is devoid of all thoughts, we can experience it as ourself only by experiencing ourself, without any thought as our own simple self-conscious being. The second sentence of this verse is a longer but still quite simple question. Ula porul, ulal ara, ulat te, uladal, ulam, enum, ula porul, ulal evan. The compound word ulal porul, which denotes the same real and absolute being that is denoted by the word uladu in the first sentence, literally means the thing, entity, reality, substance or essence, which is, or in other words, the existing reality or being essence. The word ulao means thought or thinking, and ara means devoid of. The word ulatte is a locative form of ulam, and therefore means in our heart, that is, in the core or innermost depth of our being, and uladal means since it is. The words ulam, enum, ulal, ula, porul mean the being essence, which is called heart. Ulal here means thinking or meditating, and evan means how or who. Thus this sentence means, since this being essence is in our heart devoid of all thought or all thinking, how to or who can meditate upon this being essence which is called our heart? That is, since our true and essential being transcends and is therefore devoid of all thoughts, how can any person think of it, conceive of it, or meditate upon it? In this sentence, the use of the word ulam or heart is very significant, because Sri Ramana not only says that our essential being exists in our heart, or innermost core, but also says that it is called our heart. In other words, ulam or heart is just another name for our essential being, which is the infinite and absolute reality. Since our heart or innermost core is our own real self, we ourselves are the absolute reality or being that exists in our heart as our heart. Moreover, in literary Tamil, ulam can be used as an alternative form of ulom, the first-person plural form of the word ul, and as such it means are, as in we are. In this context, however, ulam is not intended to mean are as a first-person plural verb, but rather are as an inclusive form of the first-person singular verb am, and hence we can translate it simply as am. Interpreted in this sense, therefore, the words ulam enum ulaporul would mean the being essence which is called am. Thus, by using this word ulam in this context, Sri Ramana indicated that the real meaning of the word heart or core when used in a spiritual context is only our essential self-conscious being, am, and also that an appropriate name for the absolute reality. The essence or substance that just is not only heart or core, but also am. In fact, since the word am necessarily implies the word I, and vice versa, either jointly or separately, I and am are the most appropriate of all names we can use to denote the absolute reality or God, because the absolute reality is always experienced directly by each one of us as I am.